We often hear the story of David and Goliath framed as an inspiring metaphor. We hear how, with God, we can defeat the giants in our own lives. But in that context alone, we actually miss the main point. Today on Truth for Life, Alistair Begg helps us dig deeper into this familiar story of David and Goliath as he continues our study called The Strength of Weakness.
John McEnroe's famous phrase from, I think, Wimbledon, "You cannot be serious," has been on my mind throughout the week as I've been studying 1 Samuel 17. The reason being that I think it sits well on the lips of the three characters who are involved in a dialogue with David in the balance of this particular chapter. Each character, Eliab his brother, Saul the king, and Goliath his opponent, respond to the appearance of David and the willingness of David to take up this challenge in such a way that suggests to the reader that at least part of their response would be aptly summarized in that phrase, "You cannot be serious." We ended last time by noting that David's arrival had sounded the missing theological note. David had walked onto the field of battle, concerned about something that apparently was no concern of the armies. It should have been, but it wasn't. And David's concern was for the glory of God's name. Appearing as he did, confronted by the scene, it was immediately clear to David that there was more at stake than simply the fate of Israel. More at stake than simply the fact that Israel looked bad. It was clear that they were sidelined by fear. When we lose sight of God, we will inevitably lose faith and heart for the battle. And we will, like the armies of Israel, begin to view the challenge from a purely human perspective. Their predicament is clear, it is a sorry predicament, and it emerges from the fact that they have a skewed perspective. They are acting poorly because they are thinking wrongly. Now, we are not to stand in judgment on them because we understand how easy it is to get ourselves in that position. And when we've begun to think wrongly and act poorly, the first thing that we need is actually the last thing that we want. Now let me show this to you in the interchange between David and Eliab. Instead of Eliab giving his younger brother a hug and admitting to David that he had sounded, that is, David had sounded, the very necessary theological note which was so sadly missing from the proceedings to this point, instead of admitting that he was in the wrong and that his younger brother was in the right, he goes on the attack. You see, the thing that he needed was the correction that David brought, but the thing that he needed was the last thing he wanted. Because he, like most of us, wanted to feel good about himself. But in his heart of hearts, every time Goliath came out on the field and challenged the armies of the living God, he, along with his colleagues, knew this is a fiasco. There's not a man among us prepared to take up the challenge. And the answer of the taunts of Goliath are met by the response of the shepherd boy, who is the younger brother of Eliab. And what Eliab needs is not what he wants. And what he wants is not what he needs. And so instead of admitting it, he goes on the attack. Look at him as he dialogues with his brother. There's more than a spoonful of jealousy. Because you see, David's faith confronts the army with their failure. David's enthusiastic inquiry makes their flat-footed inactivity all the more glaring. And it is not that Eliab's response is superficial. In fact, the phraseology in the NIV there in verse 28 says that when Eliab, David's oldest brother, heard him speaking with the men, he burned with anger. It infuriated him. to hear what his younger brother was saying. You know, in Christian terms, who a fanatic is? A fanatic is someone who loves Jesus more than I do. See? It's easy then to say, oh, no, she's just a fanatic. Instead of acknowledging that she may not be a fanatic, she may actually be approaching things properly, and the fact that she's approaching things properly highlights the fact that I am thinking wrongly and acting poorly, and so instead of responding to the challenge and opportunity that was presented by the enthusiasm of this individual, instead of acknowledging that it highlights my need and the necessary change, I go on the attack and try to sideline the person, questioning their motives and arguing against their actions. That will always be the case when we're thinking in a man-centered way. Eliab is jealous for himself. David is jealous for God and for the glory of God's name. That's why he said there's absolutely no reason why this uncircumcised loudmouth should be defying the armies of the living God. And nobody should be arguing with that. That's perfectly true. There is no reason in the world why Goliath should be able to hold court in this way for a period of some 40 days. But again, notice, instead of acknowledging the rightness of David's assessment, instead of admitting the fact that David has now sounded the necessary theological note, Eliab burns with anger, and he devalues David's position. Why have you come down here? With whom did you leave these few sheep in the desert? You can sense the contempt in his voice. He doesn't give any pride of place to the fact that David has a responsible role within the structure of the family and caring for the flock. No, it's not just sheep. It's not just a flock. It's those few sheep. And when our hearts are wicked, as Eliab's heart was wicked, then we will act in such a way as to suggest that we even know what's going on in someone else's heart. And so he says, I can see how conceited you are and how wicked your heart is. Your inquiries are ridiculous. Your inquiries are presumptuous. David, you cannot be serious. You didn't come down here to be involved in the battle. You came down here to watch the battle. That's an interesting observation, isn't it? You came down only to watch the battle. Do you see how we accuse other people of our own problems? There was no battle. They were all watching nothing. If David had been on his toes or not as nice a guy as he is, he would have said, what battle? He doesn't say that. He responds in a kind of routine fashion for siblings. What have I done now? I was only asking a question. In other words, he says, given that you battle-ready warriors are completely neutralized, is it not understandable that I or somebody else should inquire about the possibility of taking up the challenge by God's enabling and for God's glory? And his indignant tone, his confident reliance on God, his excited response catches the attention of the surrounding people who are listening to the interchange. And in verse 31, we're told that what David said was overheard, and then it was passed down the line to Saul. And as a result of that, Saul sent for the young shepherd boy. Well, that brings us to the second of these three dialogues, the first between David and Eliab, his brother, in which Eliab stands as the representative of those who are acting poorly because they're thinking wrongly. Secondly, in the dialogue that ensues between David and Saul. In verse 32, you will notice that David takes the initiative. He says to Saul, I don't want anybody to lose heart on account of this Philistine, because your servant will go out and fight him. Quite remarkable, isn't it? At first blush, it might even seem as though the charge of presumption that Eliab has brought is not without some kind of basis. But as we're going to see, that's not the case at all. In verse 33, we have Saul's response. There aren't many words, but it's pretty straightforward. As I sat and thought about verse 33, I imagined the conversation sort of going along these lines. In response to David's great suggestion, Saul looks at him and he says, oh, David, David, you're a fine wee boy, David. You really are. I like your zeal. I like your vision. I like your spirit. And one of the reasons I like it, David, is because it reminds me of myself. It reminds me when I was most aware of the battle. And I can remember similar feelings as yours. When I was your age, son. But I'm older now, wiser. This will happen to you. As you spend more time, as you get along the journey, you'll look out and you'll realize the facts will become plain. And David, the facts are plain. You're only a boy. And Goliath is a seasoned warrior. You cannot be serious about challenging him because you are not able to challenge him. In other words, Saul's response was reasoned, sensible, pragmatic, and wrong. Somewhere along the line, Saul had quit listening to his master's voice. He'd lost sight of that. In contrast to David's reply, Saul had lost confidence in God. And so he speaks the voice of reason. He speaks the voice of sensibility. He speaks in a very ordered way, in a very understandable way. He speaks in a man-centered way. And the missing theological note on the field of battle is the missing theological note in the mind of the king. A reminder to us that neither an army, nor a nation, nor a team, nor a congregation will ever outstrip its leadership. Verse 32, David said to Saul. Verse 33, Saul replied. Now these are not peers. This is the shepherd boy in dialogue with the king. But David isn't finished. Look at verse 34. But David said to Saul. David comes back and he gives a little bit of history in verses 34, 35, and 36. And the key to understanding what he says in those three verses is found in what he then says by way of explanation in verse 37. And indeed, if we do not understand verse 37, then we will make a hash of verses 34 to 36. So look at verse 37 before we rehearse the previous three verses. In verse 37, he says, "The Lord delivered me, and the Lord will deliver me." David does not respond to Saul's assertions by saying, "Well, I understand that, but I'm a lot tougher than I look." By saying, no, you haven't really got the measure of me. You don't really know who I am. He doesn't say that. No, instead, in recounting his successes, in striking down his opponents, in working with a flock, namely a lion and a bear, David says, I have known what it is to strike down these ferocious beasts, and I believe that I will be able to deal similarly with Goliath because he has defied the armies of the living God. And what is God's concern? God's concern is for his name and for his glory and for his people and for his unfolding eternal purpose and for his kingdom. And ultimately what is happening here in 1 Samuel 17 has to do with a far larger perspective than simply the defiance of a Philistine against the armies of Israel. It has to do with the Lord's anointed in the Lord's place, so that God's people in God's place may be under God's rule, enjoying God's pleasure. I think, he says, that we'll be able to proceed with this. I believe that God, who has shown himself strong in the past, will show himself strong in the present. What does David do here? David does not launch off with some great statement of bravado, What we have here is not antithetical to reason or to sensibility. I say that to you because some of you will have already begun to make the non sequitur approach in your mind, which says, oh, I get this now. You have on the one hand reason, sensibility, and pragmatism, and this is now about to be set against a great leap of faith and abandon into nothingness. No, it's not. Because in actual fact, what David does here is he combines a good memory with sound thinking. Because God did that there and then, he says, he is able to do this here and now. And since the God of the there and then remains the God of the here and now, then I believe that since Goliath has defied the armies of the living God, we can look to God together to deliver us from Goliath in the same way that he has delivered me in the past in going about my duties. If you think then of faith as the fuselage of an aeroplane, think of memory and logic as the wings. One wing is memory, and the other wing is logic. And it is this which gets the craft airborne. When we give to our nieces and our nephews a book for Christmas and we write on it Proverbs 3, 5, and 6, trust in the Lord with all your heart and do not rely on your own insight. In all your ways acknowledge Him and He will direct your path. We need to make it very, very clear to our nieces and our nephews that what the Bible says is do not rely on your own insight. It does not say do not use insight. It doesn't say take your brain out and do nothing. It says you don't rely on your perspective. You bring your insights and your analysis under the overarching rule of who God is. How do we know who God is? Because of how He has revealed Himself. How has He revealed Himself? In His glory and in His name. Where has He revealed Himself? In the unfolding of history. How then would we make application of God to the present on the basis of what we know of God in the past? See, your faith and mine this morning, our willingness to take up the challenge, our willingness to face the battle, our flat-out preparedness to admit to our abject weakness and need will be directly tied to our memory and our ability to think soundly on the basis of memory. Christianity is not a mindless faith. Christianity is not a call to come and take your brain out and put it under the seat and then launch into some oblivion. No. David highlights this for us. You see, David is not left to us as this wonderful example of a guy who's able to go out because he is, the right stuff. It's not because David is the right stuff. It's because he trusts in the right God. You don't go out tomorrow because you're the right stuff. You're clearly not the right stuff. And neither am I. Weak, impoverished, fearful, doubting, bringing memory to bear with sound thinking, casting ourselves afresh upon the promises of God. You see, that's all David does. If God helped him rescue a lamb, wouldn't He help him rescue a nation? If God gave him deliverance from a bear and a lion who were only doing what their natural instincts caused them to do, would He not give them deliverance from this great Goliath character? If God had been faithful to His promises in the past, would He not be faithful to His promises in the present? And David said to himself, yes, He would. The foe is still the same foe. The circumstances are still the same circumstances. The challenge is still the same challenge. It's not because David is the right stuff. You see, it's not all about me. It's all about Him, isn't it? And the soldiers it's all about us. We're looking bad. Yes, you are looking bad. But it's not all about you. It's all about Him. And until you realize it's all about Him, you'll be standing there for another 40 days and 40 nights. And so will the contemporary church. And then it finishes, of course, with the the Halloween event there in verses 38 and 39. That is the dressing up. Saul says, well, you've convinced me, so let's get you kitted out for this. It's appropriate, isn't it? I'm sure I'll get a note or two. It's just I'm being facetious. Relax. But it is a tragic comic picture, isn't it? Dressing him up, putting on a coat of armor. You'll notice that Saul dressed David, verse 38. And then David said, no, I'm sorry, this isn't going to work. He did a couple of runs around the family room, and he said, no, this is not me. So Saul dressed David, verse 38. David undressed, verse 39. David took his staff in his hand, chose 5 smooth stones from the stream, put them in the pouch of his shepherd bag, and with his sling in his hand, he walked off to challenge the Philistine. And Saul stood back on the parapet and looked out and saw his boy go. And he says, oh, David, you cannot be serious. The Lord's anointed goes forward to battle, as we'll see next time, pointing forward to the Lord's anointed, the Messiah of Israel, going forward to the fight, proceeding up the hillside to a cross, and the world looking on then and despising the scene, and looking on now and saying the same thing as then. Are you telling me that in the death of this Galilean carpenter, this proclaimed Messiah of Israel, we have the pivotal event of human history, we have the answer to the predicament of the sinful, warring lives of men and women, and we reply, yes, in this scene of weakness is the greatest power the world could ever know. And our friends watch us drive away. And they say, you cannot be serious. But yes, we are. Yes, we are.
You're listening to Truth for Life with Alistair Begg, and a message from our series titled The Strength of Weakness. It can be very freeing to realize that life is not about us and our glory. Our life is about God. We live to please Him alone. That truth changes our entire life paradigm, gives us a new perspective on the trials we face. That's not to say that we aren't still overwhelmed at times or wearied when life gets hard. At some point, all of us experience seasons where we wonder just how much longer we can hang on. Even though we know our hope is in Christ, the daily difficulties of nonstop hardship can take a toll. So if you find yourself struggling in this way today, or if you know someone who is, we want to recommend to you a wonderfully helpful book titled Strength for the Weary. This book points us to God's promises in the second half of Isaiah, a section sometimes referred to as the Book of Consolation. If you're feeling too weary to keep going, this book will be an encouragement. It will remind you that our ultimate hope is in God. We want to invite you to request a copy of the book when you give a needed gift today in support of Truth for Life. Call 888-588-7884, or if it's easier, you can request your copy online at truthforlife.org. I'm Bob Lepine. Tomorrow, Alistair continues offering a fresh perspective on David and Goliath, reminding us that it's not about us and our courage or strength. It's all about God. Be sure to listen Friday. This daily program features the Bible teaching of Alistair Begg, and it's furnished by Truth for Life, where the learning is for living.